Hello and welcome to the Billow Frock tutorial. Today I'm bringing you an updated pattern with sizes, different sizes other than size small, so extra small to extra large. I did a tutorial last year with a black dress. I wanted to update it, you know, and give a more comprehensive tutorial. If you get my pattern, it's linked below, side note. Make sure that you read the README instruction file. It'll show you everything like yardage, materials, flat pattern measurements. So just make sure you don't skip that file because it's going to answer all your questions. If you enjoy this video, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe if you want to see more. Hashtag Lydia Naomi, hashtag Billow Frock if you make this dress. Tag me at Lydia Naomi Studio. I'd love to see your creation. And without further ado, let's get into the tutorial. To sew the lovely Billow Frock, you don't need a whole lot. I'm using a queen bed sheet that I thrifted. It's 72 inches wide by 104 inches long, and it fits the entire pattern, so I was really happy about that. I thought I would use this orange gingham bias tape, but ended up making matching tape later because I had enough fabric. You'll also need elastic, matching thread, and of course my pattern. Make sure that you check the README file for material yardage and notion lengths. Time to cut out the pattern. I was concerned that this sheet wouldn't accommodate my pattern, so I just created a layout on Illustrator for the specific dimensions, and wonder of wonders, it fit. Because my tier pieces are so wide, I actually cut them on the cross grain instead of the grain so that I can get the full piece instead of piecing it together. You'll find that you'll probably have to do this as well unless you have super wide fabric. Whenever you cut anything on fold, snip a little notch at the folds and this will mark the center of your pieces. Do this for all the skirt pieces and for the bodice. Also, the tier pieces can get confusing because they're similar in shape, so just remember to mark the top of your tiers and whether it's the front or back on the wrong side of your fabric with some chalk. Also note that the seam allowance is a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters everywhere except the neckline, which is a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters to coincide with the bias tape. I've created a guide for what edges of your pieces to overlock before assembling. Some edges we will overlock as we go, like the tier seams, for example. I had enough fabric left to create bias tape after cutting everything. It's nice to be able to have matching bias tape. You can also buy pre-made bias tape, but if you want to create bias tape for yourself, it's not difficult at all. Start by cutting your fabric in strips at a 45-degree angle to the selvage. I just fold my fabric at a 45-degree angle and cut in line with that angle. Now layer your separate pieces together at 90 degrees and sew diagonally. Next, you're going to cut off that excess seam allowance, iron it flat, and feed your long strip through a bias tape maker to iron the folds in place.
It's so cute. Oh, Pepper.
The result is a nice pile of linguine. To begin, fold in each hem binding down the center and then fold in one edge 3/8 or 1 centimeter to prep for attaching it to the sleeve hem. Then take each sleeve and sew a double row of basting stitches along the sleeve hem. Pepper's made herself at home once again. How do I move such cuteness?
Pepper. No. get off. You gotta get off. Go on. Go on.
Gather the sleeve to match your hem binding, then place the unfolded side of the hem binding right side to the right side of the sleeve hem and sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, or 13 millimeters. We have now gone as far as we can with the sleeve, so let's move on to the bodice. Let's start with the front bodice. The stylistic shaping of all the front pieces is curved at the top, kind of like a rising sun, so keep that in mind so that you don't get confused with which pieces to apply. Apply the front portion of your raglan sleeve to your bodice. The front is indicated by a single notch in the armhole areas. Pin in place and then sew these seams at a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters. We're going to do the exact same step for the back. The back has a double notch in the armhole area, and again, we are going to sew at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that you are done, lay out the bodice flat, and you're going to finish the neckline with the bias tape that you created. Unfold your bias tape to line up the edge with the neckline, and you're going to sew around the entire neckline. Leave a couple inches of space from the end of the bias tape so that you can join the ends. In the same way, stop sewing your bias tape a couple of inches from where you started, then pinch the ends together. You can mark where they line up with a little snip, and then sew it. Then finish by sewing up that little gap. Now you can understitch, which is essentially stitching the seam allowance to the bias tape really close to the seam. To create that elastic channel, sew down the unsewn folded side of the bias tape. Don't forget to leave a little gap so that you can feed through the elastic. I'm making a size small billow frock, so I'm going to use a 40-inch long piece of elastic. Check the chart in the README file for recommended lengths. You can use a safety pin to feed through your elastic and then try it on. So I'm trying it on just to see where the elastic lies. So making sure that the shoulder is centered, and then just seeing. The back is supposed to be low, but with all of the fabric that's going to be hanging on it, it's definitely going to drop down a bit. So I'm not going to loosen the elastic. If you're happy with how your neckline looks, go ahead and sew up the end of your elastic, push it into the channel, and sew up the gap on your bias tape. And that is the bodice completed. Time to tackle the skirt tiers. As I mentioned, your front tiers are shaped like the rising sun, so make sure that you have all the right pieces. Start with your top tier and sew the pocket bags to the side of your top tier at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter instead of the 1/2 inch. This just makes for an easier sew and a more hidden pocket. Once you've sewn it, fold it back and understitch. This will keep your pocket nice and crisp and clean, and crispy sewing is the best. With your pockets in place, we can now add a double basting stitch to the top of the tier. Before you do that, place a pin at the center notch of your tier. That way the center marking won't get lost in the gathers. You can stop and restart the basting stitches at the center point of the panel. That way you won't have to gather for such a massive width. This will become even more handy for the bottom tiers, which are double this length. You don't necessarily have to do it for the top tier. Once you've sewn your gather stitches, pin the center of your top tier to the center of your bodice, and then gather to match the base of the bodice. Then you can unpin it, flip the tier up so that the right side is facing the right side of your bodice, pin it in place, and then sew a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters for seam allowance. I like to sew with the gathers on top so that I can see that they are even and I can adjust it as I see fit. After this, serge the raw edge of your finished seam to clean it all up. I also ended up top stitching each tier seam later, just makes it nice and crispy. Now I'm taking my massive bottom tier and minus the pocket step, I'm going to repeat the exact same steps that I did for the top tier. So after sewing your basting stitches, pin the center to the center of the upper tier and gather to match the hem. Sew and serge and top stitch if you want, and your entire front is completed. Let's move on to the back tiers. Now the back is shaped like a smile, so keep that in mind for how you apply the tiers. They should all be smiling at you. Just like the front, we add the pockets, then add the basting stitches, pin it to the center of the bodice and gather to match, then face the right sides together to sew and serge. Serge is the same thing as overlock, just in case anyone is confused. The back bottom tier is straight along the bottom and curved like a smile at the top. We're going to once again gather, sew, and serge. And that leaves us with a completed back dress. Only 3 more steps and we are done this dress. This dress looks hard when you look at the finished product, but it's actually quite easy. Let's finish up the side seams. Start by matching the front and back together with the right sides facing. Then you're going to sew from the sleeve hem down to the pocket, around the pocket bag, and then down to the hem on both sides of the dress. I realized that one of my pockets was misaligned, so I took the time to seam rip it and then re-sewed it in place before sewing up the side seams. As you near the pocket, stitch a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters past the top edge of the pocket bag and backstitch to reinforce. Then with your needle down, lift your presser foot and pivot your fabric so that you are in line with the pocket bag edge and sew around the pocket bag. When you get back to the side seam, backstitch in the same way after pivoting and continue your stitch to the hem of the dress. After stitching both sides of the dress, you can finish the hem. So double fold at a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters along the hem and sew to finish. You can definitely pre-fold and pin in place or iron in place before sewing, but I just like to fold and sew as I go. If you have a hem roller foot, you can also use that. It will work really nicely as well. So let's just finish up the sleeve hem. All we need to do is fold in the binding and stitch in the ditch. You can start by trimming a bit of the gathered seam allowance just to make it less bulky. Then you can fold under your sleeve hem binding so that the fold just passes the original stitch. And then on the right side of your garment, stitch in the seam, catching the fold of the binding on the back. And here is our finished hem binding. And here's a close-up of the outside of the pocket all finished up. You can see that the pocket understitching is back from the edge, making it much more discreet. And here is my hem, which definitely needs ironing. So that is your last step. Just press everything, the hem, the side seams, the pocket, the neckline. Get out all those wrinkles so that you have a nice, crisp, and clean garment. I always say this, ironing gives the garment a professional look So here is the final dress. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like, comment, and subscribe. Tag me on Insta if you make this dress. And finally, enjoy watching me frolic in the golden sun.